thank you all for coming, and thank you indeed for the kind invitation. So this is a truly schizophrenic experience. I'm seeing my words appear before me. This is how I'm going to write all my books in the future. I'm just going to talk into a microphone and magically the book is going to appear before me. So thank you also for submitting the questions. I promise I will attempt to answer them, but I cannot promise that I will answer them. But hopefully I will be able to get somewhere close to being able to answer them. If during the course of my presentation you want to ask more questions, please feel free to interrupt me. If my answers are not very good answers, please feel free to ask more questions for more clarification and so on. So I want this to be interactive for you to take this as an opportunity to ask questions. If my English is too bad, let me know. I'm not actually joking. I gave a series of lectures in Nanjing some years ago, and all the students in the class had learned English from American teachers, and they had no idea what I was talking about. They're like, we don't even know what English we're speaking, but it's not the English that we know. So I do apologise in advance for my terrible accent, which I know it can be difficult for people who have learned English from Americans or from immigrants. So, assemblage theory. I became interested in this probably about 10 years ago. And mostly I became interested in it because other people were interested in it, and I was kind of interested in what they were interested in. And that's why I started reading Deleuze. When I was a postgraduate student nearly 15 million years ago, it was like dinosaurs walking the earth when I started reading Deleuze. Somebody said to me, oh, you should read Anti-Oedipus. And I was like, it just seems like fashionable nonsense. I don't think I'm going to read that. But anyway, I kind of conceded the point and decided to read it, and then became mildly obsessed with it. Spent the next 30 years reading it. So it can happen. Be careful, children. Don't go playing with Deleuze. Who knows where it will take you or ruin your life. How was I going? I became interested in assemblage theory because other people were interested in it. And mostly this was because I was working with social scientists. And social scientists, so people working in like education studies, but human geography, and public health, and a whole range of disciplines, became very interested in assemblage theory, I think as a kind of parallel or maybe a supplement to ANT, to active network theory, which have a common point of origin, but not the same thing, but have a common point of origin. For the people who are reading ANT, I highly recommend you go back and read the Russian formalists from which Latour took the ideas. It's very, very interesting. And once you think about it from the perspective, the actantral function from literature is actually really, really interesting to try to apply in a straightforward sense, rather than Latour's version. But anyway, so these things were parallel. I became quite interested in it. And then what I started to realise is that a lot of the versions of assemblage theory that I was reading were kind of attributing the ideas to Deleuze, but did not seem to show any real understanding of Deleuze. And so I thought this is something that maybe I should take a look at, and I became fascinated by, on the one hand, how bad it was, and then on the other hand, in a more positive sense, what kind of possibilities that might create for me to look at again. I mean, this is kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true. I actually don't mind bad Deleuze, as it were, like people doing Deleuze badly, I'm kind of fine with. It's like we all do that. But what I objected to was the idea of bad Deleuze being mistaken for good Deleuze. And at that point I thought, yeah, we've got to get involved here and somehow make some kind of intervention. So my intervention into assemblage theory was really premised on that this was bad Deleuze being taken for good Deleuze, and therefore we needed to kind of think about how to do that differently. So I'm not going to spend any time talking about the bad Deleuze. I'll try to just only talk about the good Deleuze. So where does assemblage theory begin? If you are reading Deleuze and Guattari mostly in English, the term does not appear until you read 1,000 Plateaus. But if you were reading it in French, it is already there in Anti-Oedipus. It just did not get translated as assemblage. So it was not easy to see and was not as visible. I don't tend to like to talk about translation a lot. It's a super difficult thing to do, and I have the greatest respect for anybody who attempts translation. But one of the things that is worth thinking about and reminding yourself is that assemblage is not the original word that Deleuze and Guattari used. Okay? Assemblage is a French word, but it's a French word that we also use in English. So for the linguists here, it's what's known as a loan word. English speakers have taken it from French and now we use it in an English way, but it was originally a French word. But it is not the word that Deleuze and Guattari originally used. Now that has a lot of implications, because one of the things that has happened is that people talk about assemblage and then they try to decline it and have, well, it's assembling, assembled, and so on and so forth, and connect assemblage to assembling. But the original French of agencement would be perhaps more usefully translated as arrange. And if we thought about it as arranged, arranging, arrangement, and so on, then it becomes more, I think, possible to get a strong sense of what they mean. So if you think about what arranging can mean in English, so if you arrange to meet someone, that's an arrangement. You might have an arrangement with a friend whereby they let you borrow their car on Friday, that's an arrangement. But also we talk about arranging music, so we take a piece of music and transform it and arrange it. So I think what's important to think about from the outset, the idea of the assemblage is trying to think about the coordination of things, if you like, in space and time. I mean, that's really the best way of thinking about arrangement, is the coordination in space and time. Okay? So that's one thing, that's just sort of the starting point. If we think, well, why did they come up with this term assemblage and what does it really replace? Well, there's two kinds of answers to that. First of all, in a number of the translations of Guattari's books, so the translations from French and English, at the end of the book he produced a glossary so that people reading the English version would have a sense of what he was talking about. So in one of those glossaries, he said, so he defined it, so it's not the translator, it's Guattari himself, he said that the term assemblage replaces the psychoanalytic term complex. Now, if you think about what a complex is, so am I right in thinking you all know what the Oedipal complex is? Hands up if you know what the Oedipal complex is. No? What?
Oedipus complex.
Did I mispronounce it? My English again is terrible. Oedipal complex, Freud, psychoanalysis, Oedipus complex. Hands up if you know what that means. Don't lie now. You do. Yeah, but you're the most famous person in the room, so of course you do. For the non-famous people, do you know what it means? No? Okay, well, see, that's why I asked these questions. Otherwise, I would be assuming you all knew this, and you didn't, and then the next 20 minutes of me talking would make zero sense. Okay, so, super fast lesson in Freud. So the idea of the Oedipal complex goes something like this. Freud was sitting in the theatre one day, watching this play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex. And in this play, I won't give the whole story, but the short version of the story is Oedipus is walking along the road one day, before that, Oedipus's father is told that one day his son will kill him, and so he asks somebody to kill his son. This person can't do it and places the son elsewhere. Anyway, one day Oedipus' father is walking on the road, he meets this young man, they have an argument about who knows what, and then this young man, as it happens, Oedipus is this guy's son, and lo and behold, this guy kills his father. So the first part of the prophecy comes true. Then Oedipus goes to the town of Thebes, he meets his mother, falls in love with her, and ends up marrying her, and there's a curse upon the town, and whatever. So that's the story of Oedipus. Anyway, Freud's sitting there in the theatre somewhere in Vienna, and he's sitting there and he's like, this is the story of human desire. This is the universal truth of humanity. I mean, you do have to wonder if someone sitting there in the theatre, sort of imagine maybe had a couple too many wines before the show started to have the boldness to think I've discovered the universal truth of humanity. But anyway, that's what he thought. And so he kind of came up with the idea, and this is what the Oedipal complex is that all children from the moment they are born have a strong libidinal desire for their mother, okay, which they come to understand is obviously forbidden by the father. And so therefore, they have to disavow their desire for the mother and resign themselves to the authority of the father and therefore not fulfill their desire. So that is the Oedipal complex. Well, the Oedipal complex, actually one more step from that. The Oedipal complex comes in when we are unable to resign and disavow our desire. So if we are unable to give up on that attachment. Okay? Now, obviously, Freud does not necessarily think that every person desires their mother in a sexual way. So this was then sort of reinterpreted as sort of the structure of desire, that we desire what we cannot have, and then through life resign ourselves to the idea that we must always accept some kind of a substitute for that thing that we genuinely want. Okay? And so one version of this would be, and this is sort of how it's been interpreted in sort of cultural study and capitalism, look, I really want to be a billionaire, but I can't. But I can buy a Tesla car and be kind of like a billionaire, and so therefore my impossible desire can be fulfilled in a kind of symbolic way. Okay? So that was a sort of very powerful idea, and most of what we know of as psychoanalysis is built around that idea. In the 1960s and 70s, you then have somebody like Althusser and the sort of Marxist group that surrounded him, so people like Rancière and so forth. And they wondered whether or not you could combine Marxism and psychoanalysis. Would it be possible to explain the kind of current state of contemporary society by using psychoanalysis? So what Marxism was concerned about at that time was two things. On the one hand, they could not understand why people had not risen up in revolution. Because, if you look around, cost of living was very high, there were billionaires not paying taxes, etc., etc. There's plenty of reasons to think that the situation should not be tolerable and that people should rise up, but they never did. In fact, and this is the second point, people seem to be actively looking for reasons to subordinate themselves to the state. And one of the things that Deleuze quotes from Spinoza and also from Wilhelm Reich is the idea, he says, why do people fight for their oppression as though it were their freedom? Okay? And so Deleuze and Guattari were kind of interested in this problematic, but they thought that neither psychoanalysis nor Marxism or the combination of psychoanalysis and Marxism could really solve this problem. And the reason they couldn't solve it is because they had already assumed that the only structure of desire was wanting something that you don't have, resigning yourself to something that is sort of somehow secondary to that thing. And so they began to say, well, what would happen if we were to reimagine desire differently? If we started from a different premise. Okay? So instead of starting from one complex, the Oedipal complex, what if we put forward the idea that there was potentially a multiplicity of complexes? Now, if they kept using the term complex, that would kind of confuse everyone. So instead, they used the word desiring machine. And desiring machine is the forerunner to assemblage. So in Anti-Oedipus they use the term desiring machine, in the Thousand Plateaus they use the term assemblage, but it's basically the same idea. In an interview following the publication of Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze said, too many people are using this word desiring machine like they know what it means, so we're going to stop using it. People can find their own words and we're going to invent a new word. But the same basic idea travels from the first book to the second book, and in a sense, if we just think about it as a problematic rather than as a word, then we can understand it. So then the idea of the assemblage is first and foremost to think about the relationships of desire within a social setting. So it's not sort of individual desire, but it's a social form of desire. Okay, so think about it as the combination of Freud and Marx minus the Oedipal complex. It's perhaps the easiest, and it's not exact, but it's an easy way to begin to think about it. How do we think about desire from within a social complex? So Deleuze then said, well look, we want to combine Freud and Marx, but we don't want it to be 1 + 1 = 2. Rather, we want it to be 2 - 1 = 1. And so they wanted to get rid of something. And what they wanted to get rid of was the idea that there is a distinction to be drawn between material reality, which is Marxism, and psychic reality, which is psychoanalysis, and have only one reality, which they call desire and production. So in other words, there is no distinction to be drawn between desire and material reality. That what you desire is material reality, and whatever we think of as material reality can only be understood from the perspective of desire. So there are no material things in the world that exist independently of our notion of desire. So that is the sort of the basic hypothesis of assemblage theory, that there is only desire. Okay? And the desire is, as they put it, desire is productive. Okay? Now, this idea of desire as productive is quite difficult to get your head around. Is there a pen that I can use? Yes. Where's the camera? Are you okay? I was at a conference once talking about this, and my French is so horrible. So it was very funny because there was a Japanese guy in the room who was correcting my French pronunciation. He said, no, you should be saying it this way. And he is, of course, a world-famous scholar, and he was right to say it, but to me it was quite funny. Anyway, investissement. I didn't pronounce the S's to his satisfaction. Investissement. So in English, this would be investment. Now you see I also have horrible handwriting. My students are like, well, don't bother writing on the board, we've got no idea what we're talking about. And the reason why I'm doing this is, if you read Freud in English, the word you will find is this. Cathexis, not catharsis. Cathexis. Now, cathexis is, of course, a Greek word, and that is because Freud's translator into English decided that the boring German words that Freud was using didn't sound technical enough, so he translated them into Greek words, and thus we get cathexis instead of the original German word, which is, I can't spell it off the top of my head, but it's Besetzung. Now what cathexis means is it's a military term, and it would mean something like occupation. So an occupying army, when it invades a town, okay, so occupation in that sense, so of the invading army. Okay. Now the reason why this is important is because in French, this word has the same implication. It's an archaic usage of the word. It can also mean occupation. But when we get to the English word, that this meaning has kind of disappeared. So now we only have the meaning, which is also possible here, of banking. So, which is not available there. Now, like I said, I don't normally give lectures on comparative literature, but this is important for us to understand. Because in a sense, the French word has both these meanings, right? It has the meaning of occupation and of banking, but the translation only has the implication of banking, but not occupation. So why is that important? So cathexis in psychoanalysis is the discharge of affect. Okay? So when we cathect, you can say you get a moment of joy from something. That is cathexis. Okay? It doesn't have to be sexual joy, but it can be. But anything that kind of brings us joy, that you take satisfaction from, is cathexis. Okay? But in psychoanalysis, they're not kind of interested in just the regular things that we get joy from. Rather, they're interested in the things that we are kind of obsessed with and that we can't sort of get past. Okay? So the things that we are obsessed with is the idea of occupation. The desire goes towards this idea and cannot leave it alone. Okay? Now, there is like a million movies made on this topic. Okay? Every movie that you have ever seen about the obsessive boyfriend or the obsessive girlfriend or whatever is this topic. It's the thing that they cannot leave alone, that they have become obsessed with it, they're occupying that space, because they believe that if they were able to get a hold of this thing that they really want, it would give rise to the maximum cathexis, the biggest high that they could possibly achieve. They would have finally obtained the thing that they really want. Now, if we think about it in terms of banking, investment, it's the same kind of thing, right? If you make an investment, you put your money into something, you expect a reward. And Deleuze and Guattari talk about this as surplus value. So the same thing, right? Like if you're doing something that you really love, you get a reward from that, and that is the surplus value of your investment in that activity. Now, the question then becomes, how do we kind of use all this to think about assemblages? So, what I want to, I'll come to that in a second. First, does anyone have any questions on this? I realise that it's, for people who haven't read a lot of psychoanalysis, this is a lot of psychoanalysis information, translation, all in one hit. So if you have questions, you want me to review anything here, please say so.
If we don't read the book, hard for us to raise any questions about it.
Sorry?
If we do not read the books, hard for us to raise the question because we just see some terms on the board.
Yes, that's true, but if you had questions about what I have said, then you could ask them now. But if no questions, what about up the back?
Can you tell us a little bit about the cathexis and the occupation? So, yeah, I mean, that part, having a connection between the two. So occupation refers to what kind of occupation? Right now we think about job, that's occupation. But obviously this is nothing to do with that. So
no,
somehow that
not.
means our mind or person are preoccupied with something.
Yeah, preoccupied would be nearer.
Sorry for the silly questions, because you want us to answer questions.
It's not a silly question, it's a good question. This is my very bad drawing of a castle. In this castle, it contains my desire. It could be the princess, it could be the dragon, it could be treasure, it could be whatever you want, right? And I really want my desire. So what am I going to do? I'm going to surround the castle with my army. I'm I'm going to invade the castle with my army, and then I'm going to live in this castle that I have invaded, and that is occupation. And so when I get into this castle, that's cathexis. I have attained my desire. Okay?
So, occupation, that means that we do reach the goal and complete
Yeah.
our job. So, right now, perhaps we want to access our power or agency, but the point is that we fail to do that. So for here, the occupation, that means we really reach the goal and complete what we want to do.
Yes.
And satisfy our desire.
Yes, that's cathexis.
Okay.
And that's what most of us, according to psychoanalysis, never fully do. So in other words,
Yeah.
we have this thing that we really, really, really want, but we can't quite reach it. So then we have this other little castle over here. And so we try to have this castle, but we can't. We're not strong enough. And so in the end, we have that castle as our compromise. So we desire goes towards here, can't attain it, ends up here. Sort of like, if you're at the bar, most beautiful girls at the end of the table, and you think, I really want to date her, and you walk down towards her, and you realise that she's not even going to be remotely interested in you, and there's the second most beautiful girl in the room, and you go, well, she'll be. So it's the same thing. It's the idea that you can't have exactly what you want, so you make a compromise with your desire, and you satisfy yourself with this alternative. So that's sort of what psychoanalysis is talking about, that we don't get what we want, but we get a substitute that we resign ourselves to being satisfied with.
Well,
So go ahead.
I thought that that's occupied because we have completed, really satisfied. But
Well,
actually, most of the time we're in the process.
It's both, right? I go here, but I can't complete, so then I accept this as a substitute where I can.
So that we're still in the process.
Yeah.
Or small satisfaction. So somehow some kind of compromise.
It's a compromise. And the question is, how big a compromise? Like if it's a really massive compromise, then you spend the rest of your life thinking, I don't really like this castle, I actually wanted that castle. And so you spend your life feeling unfulfilled because you never really got the castle that you wanted. So that, in a sense, your desire exceeds what you have.
It's always in the process, always going on.
Yeah. So what Deleuze wanted to say, though, is that this is not a very good way of thinking about desire. That desire doesn't simply go after pre-existing things. Rather, desire produces them. So productive desire creates the castle. It doesn't go trying to invade the castle, it creates the castle. So we're shifting the way we think about desire from desire going towards a pre-existing object towards desire producing the object. Right? And that's the idea of the productive desire.
Mm-hmm.
Now they take this idea from Kant, who, I'll write it on the board. I say it in the German way, but most people pronounce it Kant, so Kant. Kant said that the imagination is capable of producing or causing its own reality. Okay. But, he said, we think of that as a psychic reality that is different from real reality. Okay. But Deleuze say, well, no, how could there be such a thing as psychic reality and real reality as two different things? In fact, they must be the same thing. So therefore, the mind produces reality, whatever reality that we think of. Now, this is not a kind of constructivist argument which says that, this table doesn't exist if I don't think about it. It doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that our encounter with the world is, in a certain sense, always phenomenological. It is always produced by our mind in relation to the world. The world continues to exist whether we're here or not here, but our interaction with it is necessarily from our own perspective and our own perception of that world. Okay? So, they're combining a modification of Kant with a modification of Marx and a modification of Freud to pull that together to produce what we think of today as assemblage theory. So assemblage theory then, at its foundation, is the idea that desire produces reality. So that's the first principle, if you like. Desire produces reality. Now, they're not saying that it is my desire that produces reality or your desire. They're saying it is collective desire. It's the desire of all of us that produces reality. Is it William Gibson who has the term consensual hallucination? Could be something like that. But we collectively produce reality, so we collectively make investments, we collectively have obsessions and occupations and so on. And so that's all part of it. So then we've got this idea of one notion of desire. We have now an idea that all desire is fundamentally collective, because you cannot desire individually. So this kind of goes to the idea that Levi-Strauss talked about, which is that there is no such thing as an individual language. Like, you can't have language by yourself, right? The minute you communicate with somebody is the moment that you have language, but it is not your private language. There can be no private language. There can only be collective language, okay? So you've got to think of it in those terms. There cannot be private desire. There can only be collective desire. You cannot desire by yourself, because the world in which you live in is the product of a multiplicity of people. There is no individual desire, there is collective desire. Doesn't mean that your desire cannot have individual permutations, right? But it means that desire itself is not individual, it is collective. Because the things that we desire are collectively constructed. And more importantly, the way we desire, which is in a sense through our language, is also collective. It exists before us, which is what Lacan says, right? We are born into language, and that language transforms us, because we never have a moment when we did not see the world other than through the language that we learn as a baby, which shapes the world for us. And we've already seen here, through moving through 3 different languages, or in fact 4 if we include the German, how those words shape how we want to see. So that point is, I think, very easy to grasp. Language transforms us, and so how we want to think about it. Right, so we've got the big picture. Now we want to start thinking about the small picture. And this is a story I'm going to tell at the conference, but I'll tell it here too, because I quite like this story, and maybe it will help us a little bit. Some years ago, I was in Taiwan at a conference. And I don't know if you know this, but Taiwan is, in addition to being the world capital of microchips, which is maybe important, but much more importantly to me, is it's the world capital of making bicycles. 80% of the world's bicycles are made in Taiwan. So anyway, I was at this conference, and I love bicycles, and there was a convention on of bicycles. I thought, fantastic! This is, the best thing ever. I'm staying in a hotel. There's a bicycle convention on. I'm going to go and look at bicycles. But in fact, it was not bicycles. It was parts of bicycles. And so there were people standing there, and I'm not joking, like literally with boxes of bolts and bits of bicycles. And so you walk around this convention looking, well, that's a pretty fascinating box of bolts. That's another fascinating looking box of bolts. And I'm like, where are the bicycles? I came to look at bicycles. And all I could see was bolts. And then I began to think about it. In a way, that is like our model of desire, right? Our desire is really composed of bolts. But when we look at it, what we see is a bicycle. But actually, what we don't ask ourselves are what were the bolts that went into making that bicycle, and what was the process that led to their maximum combination, so the best combination. Okay. So when you look at the bicycle as a mechanic, you might look at the bearings that are inside the wheel. Now, if you know anything about bicycles, you know that the ultimate bearings are to get ceramic bearings, not steel bearings, because ceramic bearings have a much lower level of friction or whatever. I'm sure I can see that whenever I talk to my wife about this, the eyes roll back. I can tell she doesn't care at all. And I'm sure that's most of you as well. But my point is that that's inside the wheel. You would never see it. You would never think about it. But to people who really care about it, it's their occupation, that they become obsessed with those things. It matters a lot. And if you put it in the machine runs better with them than if it didn't have them. And so therefore it matters to the machine itself. So if you were to think about your desire as a bicycle, you would be thinking about it as a put together object that you find attractive, that takes you places. So that's why I use the idea of a bicycle. When you get on your bike, so I love a bike, you get on it, you ride, it takes you places, right? So your desire takes you places. And whenever you look at your desire, you see a bicycle. But in fact, that bicycle is made of bolts. And it's made of bits and pieces of steel and so on and so forth, a whole other process that went into manufacturing that desire. So if you were to take a step back and say, well, how did my desire come to be? Then that is the question that Deleuze and Guattari are asking us to think about. What is my desire composed of? What are the bits and pieces that are the nuts and bolts of my desire? And that's why they call it machine desire, or a desiring machine, because they say our desire is a machine. Okay? Not a theatre like Freud thought, but a machine, and it consists of working parts. And so we can approach it as a machine and think about, well, how does it work? Now, this idea has a number of advantages, which I think is one of the reasons why social sciences have got so interested in it. If you'll permit me to draw a really bad bicycle. I have to admit, I'm loving having a whiteboard again. Nobody does that anymore where I work. The whiteboards are all gone. Like I said, a really bad drawing of a bicycle.
We know that's a bicycle.
You know it because I told you. But the point I wanted to make with my tremendously bad drawing is that there are a number of elements in this system that work together but also work independently, right? So this is the chain that goes around independently, but it also drives this wheel. So we've got this wheel going around because of that, but it also goes around independently because if you're going down a hill, you don't need to pedal at all. So if you think of those as your desires, it's possible for you to have two desires that work together but are also distinct from one another. Okay? I desire to be rich. I desire to be a good person. They can work together, but you can also just be a rich asshole that doesn't do anything for anyone, and it no longer works with this. Or you can be a rich person and think, I want to be a good person, and so you become more involved in philanthropy or whatever. Okay? So what Deleuze and Guattari were then interested in was the possibility that if desire is a machine, that it is also then composed of multiple small machines that we could then become interested in and try to think about and try to interrogate as to their relationship together, and what we can also then think of as relations of dependency. Okay? So this is the first question I was asked to talk about strata. So I always define strata as a relation of dependency, right? Looking at the bike, the wheels do not depend upon that chain. When little kids have bikes, they don't put this part in the bike at all. The kids just sit on the seat and they use their legs to push on. So there's no relation of dependency there. But for the chain, it would have no meaning at all if it was not connected to the real. So therefore there is a relationship between these. So one of the sort of like methodological questions, so before we were talking, all the professors at the front of the room asking the hard questions, one of the things we talked about was sort of methodology. So one of the ways I think that we can approach using assemblage theory in a methodological fashion is to think about the questions of dependency and relations of dependency. Which things depend on other things, and what is the nature of that dependency. So Deleuze and Guattari talk about 3 levels of strata. This is the most macro scale, which would be something like this. The sort of geological bedrock of the Earth itself, the biological bedrock of bodies, and then the sort of the top strata, if you like, of humans, of the mind, the brain, and so on and so forth. So, as humans, if our body was not alive, then clearly we could not have thought. So there is a relationship, dependency between our body and our mind. And of course, if we were not standing on solid ground, we would have all kinds of problems as well. So there again, there's a relationship of dependency between my body and the earth. But the earth does not depend on me. So there is no relationship of dependency going the other way, right? If I disappear, the earth continues on. Okay? So there's no relationship that way. But for me, I need to stand on the earth, so there is a relationship of dependency in that direction. Likewise, between my mind and my mind cannot survive without my body, so there's clearly a relationship of dependency there. But likewise, the body cannot survive completely without the mind, so there's a relationship of dependency there as well, but it's a different form. And the main thing that Deleuze and Guattari want to talk about is then how each layer of the strata is a kind of a translation and a transformation of the previous layer, but that they are not necessarily causal in relation to one another. The existence of the earth does not cause humans to come into being. The existence of humans does not cause art to come into being. It would be possible for there to be humans and no art. So it's a way of thinking about the relationship that is not thought in terms of causality, but in terms of dependence. So we can think about it in terms of dependence, not causality. But then we would still want to have a question about causality. And that causality then gets displaced onto the question of desire. That these things would not exist if we did not desire them in some way, if we did not need to produce them in some way. And I know that you are all in an art department. So if you were to ask yourself the question, why do we have art at all? Then you would be asking the Deleuzean question, you'd be asking an assemblage question, because why does art exist? Well, one answer would be a sort of sociological answer, that art is part of society, that there is a kind of cash value to it, and so on and so forth. But I mean, we don't really find that so satisfying. It's kind of obvious but not satisfying. It doesn't explain why art ever came into being at all. So then our answer might be, well, perhaps it serves a particular kind of purpose in relation to our desire. And this is what Levi-Strauss already began to talk about, what he said, and the recently deceased Frederick Jameson uses as the basis of the politically unconscious, which is that art provides a symbolic solution to a real problem. Now, if we were to translate that into Deleuze, all problems are real, and so are the solutions. So Deleuze would reject the idea that it's a symbolic solution to a real problem, but would rather say it's a real solution to a real problem. And that art does something for us that enables our desire to work in different ways. So how does that work? Well, one of the things that Guattari says, so Guattari was, he was not a psychiatrist. He's often mislabeled a psychiatrist. He started out studying pharmacology, he didn't complete his degree, he became a sort of activist, organizer, and then he got invited to work at a private psychiatric clinic where he had mostly an administrative role, but he turned administration into therapy, if you So one of the things that he did, one of his innovations, was to make everybody who was at the institute at Laborde, they all had to do different jobs. So the psychiatrists had to work in the kitchen, the patients got to be psychiatrists, people had to take out the garbage, and everybody had to do a job other than the job that they thought was their job. And his reason for that was somewhat paradoxical, which was that he said it would create antagonism. He would create antagonism. That psychiatrists would be pissed off about having to be in the kitchen or take out the garbage or whatever. And you might think, well, why on earth would antagonism be a good thing? And his answer for that was that it made everybody think about what they were doing and who they were within the institution. But it also disrupted the institution. So the institution didn't just function as, you know, we are the boss, you're the patient, you do what we tell you or whatever. It disrupted all of that and, as it were, set desire free. And so what Guattari was interested in was how do you set desire free? If the psychoanalytic model is that we always accept compromises, then desire is always compromised, it's always trapped. And he says we kind of get stuck. We think, oh, I'm so depressed, I can't do anything today. Or I'm so anxious, I can't do anything today. He said we all experience that. But the thing is, what do we do to not get stuck? How do we get going? How do we move out of being stuck? And that's what they meant by the idea of the rhizome. So the rhizome is the branch of your desire that you can kind of spread out from where you are, where you're stuck, and it can reach, you can think of it as a plant, you're in a deep, deep well, and you're looking up and you can't figure out how to get out of this terrible hole that you're stuck in. But then like a plant, you can sort of latch onto the wall, and that can grow a little bit, and it can eventually reach the sunshine, and so therefore you start to think, well actually I'm finding a way to escape. So the notion of the rhizome is always about escape. It's always about how do I become unstuck from where I am right now? How do I find my way forward? And I've always thought that's what artists do for themselves and for us. Even, like, I don't make art, but I love to go to art galleries and I walk around and I look at the art. And whenever I see works that I find particularly powerful, I feel like that's what they do for me. That they help my desire to become unstuck. That in some way it helps me to think about my situation in a different kind of way that is, you know, we use that horrible word, empowering, but in a way that's what it does, right? It helps us to reach towards sunshine and to be a little bit different. So I think that's the idea that Guattari are trying to get to us, that desire is always moving. We feel troubled when that desire gets stuck, and we look for ways to enable it to become unstuck, and that's what we call the rhizome. But that's what art does, and all our creativity is directed towards, is finding ways for things to become unstuck. All right, I have spoken for nearly an hour, and so I'm probably testing the limits of your patience. So if you have some questions, please ask them now, and then I will quickly try to respond to the questions that people gave. In politics, they call these questions on notice, right? We've already given you the questions ahead of time, questions on notice. So if we have any questions that are not on notice, happy to take them now. They're as bad as my students, they don't say anything.
Can you bear with me if I say it again?
Of course. Does
Deleuze read, let's see, what's that? Not really the Bible, you know, just from your talk, okay, you make Deleuze accessible. So that is very stimulating to me, because I have the book, but I actually have not yet opened it. It seems that that's a kind of impossible task for me. But today, I think that after your talk, I'll go back to open the book and read, okay? What I want to say is that just what you mentioned about, let's see, from the desiring machine and all that is related to the big D, desire, and also the collection of desires. And then moving on, okay, that's this desiring machine. And then moving on, how can we get out of the desire and set desire free? And so the rhizome. Okay, yeah, I heard about that, the Chinese. So somehow things that kind of related to that hard sutra. I'm sure if I'm right with that. So somehow we read, the Buddhism, they have the 色界空, so get out of the, the phenomenon, the world. Yeah, so any connection between that? If you emphasize the, almost the things, people, machines, people, all these things are interdependent, all the things are interconnected, then what is the core, something get them moving? Since that's a big desire and all kinds of desire. And then finally, ultimately, they have the big question, how can we get out of here? So somehow, anyway, that reminds me of the, heart sutra. I'm not sure if I'm right with that. So get out of the, this kind of the phenomenon of this world.
Yeah, a lot of people have wanted to make that connection. I don't think it's there in their work explicitly. They do refer to the German author, Swiss author, I guess, Hermann Hesse, who wrote about Siddhartha. But I don't know that that's convincing enough. But they do also refer to so Carlos Castaneda, who was Mexican-American and claimed to be doing anthropology of indigenous people in Mexico, but was probably making it up, which they say is actually more interesting for being made up than for being true. So they were interested in various cosmologies that were non-Christian. But I don't think you would be able to make the strong claim that what they offer is finally a cosmology. If it's a cosmology, it would be a cosmology of mind and of fantasy. I don't think that they're saying that we can get out of here. I think they would say we are condemned to be here. Yeah. So what do we do to keep moving so that we don't feel here to be here? So it's more existentialist in that sense. But yeah, I think there's no doubt that there are those elements in what they were doing. And going back to your earlier point, and I'm of course very flattered that you would say that I can make it accessible. But one of the things it's worth remembering is that when Deleuze and Guattari wrote this book, there's sort of a couple of things to bear in mind. First of all, they were already, well, Deleuze anyway, was already a very senior professor and had been writing books about philosophy for a long time. But I don't think that's the most important thing. I think the most important thing is that A Thousand Plateaus was the product of 7 years worth of seminars that were in rooms like this with people jam-packed, and every week the students brought material. So he would be talking about the idea of the refrain, for example. Then next week all the students would say, oh, we found all these fantastic examples of the refrain. And then they would talk about that, and that would get built into the book. So it's not a book that was written by one person or even 2 people. It was a book that was written by 50 people. And so it has the density of a book written by 50 people. So if you allow yourself to think, well, I'm not trying to understand what 50 people did, but rather I'm the 51st person who's making a contribution to this book. And you read it and you kind of just let it wash over you. And you read it a few times and you just sort of, you find little handholds. And then I think you can sort of slowly put it together. But I sort of became an avid reader of Deleuze and Guattari precisely because it annoyed me so intensely that I didn't understand it, that I felt I had to do the work and figure out how to understand it. And that took a long time, of course. But I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes annoying books can be very productive if you allow yourself to be annoyed by them in a productive way.
So produce more desires.
Yeah, exactly. You go back, you read what they were referring to, you draw diagrams, like I find drawing diagrams of how this concept connects to that concept. Those things really help. And there is a guy, I wish I could remember his name, I'm sorry, I have a terrible memory. But there is an American Chinese student who has been drawing pictures, sort of pictogram diagrams of 1,000 Plateaus. And I have seen some of his art, it's quite fantastic. I don't know that I necessarily agree with his pictures, but I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that he draws pictures, and they are quite spectacular. So the other thing I would suggest you do is to draw, to make things. Like I remember I was with a bunch of architects, and we were discussing how you might actually produce a model, a 3D model of the relationship between the assemblage, the what about organs, the abstract machine, and so on and so forth. So actually trying to draw them and model them and so forth is a very good way to try to understand them, because then you read it differently. You deconstruct the work into a set of propositions that you can put together and definitions. This plus this, and how do they work together? And that's what I did, and I did it over years, and kind of worked through pictures and created maps and so on. And that's, I think, the only way to really progress. And of course, your discussion groups. I guess the other thing I would say is don't take the words too literally. Right? Like, I never forget I was at a conference in Canada, and this young student said, "Oh, I just spent the last 6 months studying plant biology so I could understand the rhizome." And I was like, why on earth would you do that? It has nothing to do with plant biology. So it's not exactly a metaphor, but it's a concept, and you can't. And this is what I mean by that, the sort of relation of dependency. Reading about plant biology will not tell you how the rhizome works. Reading Deleuze and seeing what the concept does within their work, that will tell you about how the rhizome works. So you have to read it imminently, not expect there to be an answer outside the text. But the answers are only in the text. All right, any other questions? No? Do you want to recess? Lunchtime? Yeah, something.
Okay. There's one example. It's called Mother and Baby.
Mm-hmm.
It's by Klein, the psychiatrist Klein.
Yep.
And Deleuze and Guattari use this example to explain design machine.
Yes.
Is it correct?
Yeah, it's the case of Little Richard.
Yeah. So we got
Not the singer.
they associate to the example of your bicycle.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know the case, Little Richard, this is during World War II in England. Richard his family lived in London. When the Germans were bombing London, they evacuated a lot of the children to rural parts of England, and he ended up in Scotland to try to get them away from London so they would be safe. And so he's separated from his family. His father was in the Air Force away at the war, and so he was quite distressed, and he was brought to see Melanie Klein, who was a Freudian psychotherapist. And because the kid was so little, he didn't really do a lot of talking, so they had a toy train set in the therapy room, and so Richard was taking his train around and so forth. And so Melanie Klein says to Richard about the train, this train really is Daddy. The train stands for Daddy, and then when he takes it into the station, that's the train going into Mummy, and so obviously trying to equalise it, make it about parental desire. And Richard was like, no, don't like that, throws the toy away and runs out of the room, which for Klein meant that obviously she was right. But for Deleuze and Guattari, it meant obviously she was wrong. That in fact, the train functions as a desiring machine, but maybe it functions as a machine of escape. That what Richard is trying to do with his train is to escape from his anxieties. He's in a situation that he feels very, very stressed about. He doesn't want to be in this therapist's room. His father's at the war, and so on and so forth. And so by moving the train, he moves his desire, and perhaps he feels better. So it's a completely different interpretation of the same set of material, but interpreted from quite a different premise of how desire actually works. So for the entire desire is about becoming unstuck, whereas for psychoanalysis, desire is sort of stuck in a perpetual loop of wanting what it can't have and being forced to disavow that desire. Any other questions?
I use ChatGPT to just Okay. I want to ask a question. Artificial intelligence and big data seem to bind us more tightly within a certain system and a shared imagination of desire. How should we feel this phenomenon? Is it a depension or resistance? I want to ask about the possibility of delink.
Is that one of the questions in here already, or is this a new question? Sounded familiar, so currently AI popular trend. Is that the one?
No.
So, no, it's a different question.
No, not in the list.
Oh, so sorry, you guys are talking, you're being bad students. Sorry, I apologize. I have slight hearing loss, so it's hard for me to hear, so would you be so kind as to say it again?
Okay. 就再讲一次吗？
Yeah, you can read it again.
Artificial intelligence and big data seem to bind us more tightly within a certain system and a shared imagination of desire. How should we feel this phenomenon? Is it the potential or resistance? I want to ask about the possibility of delinkings in this state.
So you want to delink from AI, is that what you're saying?
Or what about that imagination?
Right. Yeah, look, I think that AI is, it's obviously very problematic in many, many ways, but it's also doing many things which are beneficial, and it's very hard for us to know what to do. So, for example, I was reading a report recently which found that an AI system could more reliably and more rapidly detect cancer in X-rays than doctors could. You could put a team of doctors in the room and they were not as reliable or as accurate as the AI system was, which of course was designed like that. And so therefore the AI system was in a sense better than a doctor. Which is fine, except that the price that we pay for that is that those other doctors are now like, well, the machine does it for me, so I don't have to know. And so it's like the machines get smarter and we get dumber, to the point where the machines can do what we can't do. And that, in old-fashioned Marxism, is alienation. We cease to know how to make the machines that we work with. And AI is doing that to us at a cognitive level. Like if you go back to sort of the Industrial Revolution, and you had, the weavers, so predominantly women working in homes making silk or cotton or whatever, and then suddenly the machines come along, the machines do it much, much faster, puts them all out of business. But not only puts them out of business, the skill is lost. Like you would be hard pressed to find anybody that actually knew how to do a lot of this stuff now. Like I always read about renovations of houses, and the house might be 500 years old in this particular kind of joint, and they say, we don't know a single tradesperson who's capable or even knows how to do that particular piece of carpentry anymore, because nobody does it. And we have machines that can do it better and faster. So I think that's the problem, and the question that we should be asking with respect to AI is what happens if the machines get smart and we get dumb, then what does that hold for the future? And clearly that's problematic, I think. The other thing I would say that, this is my observation, is that there's a lot of people who say that digital natives, so like all the people like you, young people, who have never known a time before computers. They always make the joke that they are better at computers than we are because we're old and we can remember a time before computers. But I'm here to tell you that that is wrong. Okay? And it's not just because I'm an old person and I think old people still have value, God damn it. But the entire structure of the computer replicates thinking systems that pre-existed the computer. So the filing cabinet was a piece of technology for archiving material, right? And so the filing cabinet gets translated onto the computer, but it's still fundamentally the same way of thinking. And so when people like me look at a computer and think in terms of files, I sort of mentally flicking through files, and that's a system that I can understand and recognise. But I find that my students have no conceptualisation of what filing means. They don't see filing as organising, they don't. Like the computers are a total mess. They don't use the architecture that we use because that's what we had to do in order to find something. Like those of you who are old enough to remember using the card index system in libraries, again, that's a system that then gets put onto the laptop or onto the computer, the software, and replicates those old systems of how do you search for things, how do you hierarchize, and so on and so forth. So actually, I think my point of this story is we're going to reach a point where the generations to come will have no recollection of the physical architecture that got replicated by the machine, and therefore it will be foreign to them. And apparently already that's happening in warehouses. So warehouses are designed for the sort of lights out warehouse, no humans involved. And the filing architecture for that is for a machine, not for a person. And from what I've read, people can't function in these environments. They can't find anything because it doesn't have the logic that we are used to. It now has its own new machine logic. So the machine is designed for itself in this sense. So I think that's the risk. The risk is we are creating a situation in which we will not be able to use or design or understand the things that we have created, and there won't be people around who can, other than sort of the tech scientists. And I don't know that I want to let the tech scientists design the future for the rest of us. Any other questions? Yeah.
I hope I want to, first of all, I want to share the experience during Professor Buckner's speech. We're talking about assemblage during the speech. At the same time, I also being asked what assemblage is during your speech. My question is that the assemblage meaning?
That you thinking about the assemblage as we are talking?
During your examples from the bicycles or the Oedipus. Sorry. I'm being asked what assemblage is. I think the process being asked, can I say, is the assemblage. And I also have the second question. From your speech, I also thinking about also in the 1970s, there's a philosopher, Simondon. From some people said Deleuze is influenced by Simondon in some point. So how do you?
So, I mean, in response to the Simondon question, then yes, and clearly they were influenced, but I don't think that they replicate what he does, and nor can we read Simondon as a kind of decoder ring for Deleuze and Guattari. One doesn't decode the other. I think there is a relationship, but it's not an explanatory thing. And Simondon was more concerned with technical machines than they were concerned more with desiring machines. So there's sort of a shift in terms of how they approach things. But yes, of course, obviously there is high degree of sympathy between Wittgenstein and family resemblance.
Yeah, but there's a individuation from Simondon.
Okay.
It really reminds me of assemblage.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't seen that, so I can't comment. But yeah, I think obviously there is, as I said, high degree of sympathy between their projects. I don't know they were actually friends, so they probably talked about these things a lot. I guess the other thing is I haven't really defined assemblage all that well at all, which is obviously pretty bad. Where I was trying to get to with the idea of the complex is that the complex is an organisation of desire that we can say works. Okay? I desire something that is forbidden, I make a compromise, and that works. That gets me through the day. So that's an arrangement of desire. And it's sort of premised on the idea that desire is ceaselessly productive, but also that in being productive, it becomes disturbing to us. Like if we have too much desire, we're constantly desiring all the time, then that we find that hard to deal with. So we have to manage our production. And in a way, that's their definition of schizophrenia. That schizophrenia is uncontrolled and uncontrollable production. Just thoughts firing off all the time, can't do anything with them, constantly kind of thinking about things or overthinking things. And most of us don't want to think all the time. We want to think a little bit, but we don't want to think all the time. And for the kids at the back of the room staring at their phones, it's the overthinking, right? Like the thing that we worry about in this day and age is overthinking everything. Well, overthinking is precisely too much production of thought that we are trying to manage. So for the kids who are staring at their phones, and there's at least half, don't worry, I'm used to this. But I will say this, the other thing that's really interesting to think about technology is there's a very famous piece by Heidegger where he was stuck in a train station, and this is in 1930s Germany, and of course there was nothing. There was no shops, there was no television, there was no radio, there was no one to talk to, he didn't have a newspaper, nothing. Bored out of his brain, thinking, where's my train? And then what he realised is that he had his thoughts for company. And so at the moment of extreme boredom was also the moment of the most kind of energetic production of thought. And what I thought about this a long time ago when I was sitting in an airport, like everybody else, and you just sort of watch the whole, everyone in line like this, everyone everywhere, half the classes. And if you think about what's happening is, instead of being bored, which is what you should be, because if you were bored, you would be thinking. But because you're not giving yourself over to boredom, and by looking at your phone, you are moving from an active production of thought to the passive reception of information. So if you want to think about what kills creativity, it's that. The passive reception of information means that you don't think. Your brain doesn't have to do anything. You just like, yeah, whatever, we've got social media, whatever. So I think that would be the other point about AI to think about, is that we keep producing systems that enable us to not think, as though somehow thinking was the problem. Like, students complain, oh, your lectures are really boring. And I'm like, well, it's your problem, I don't care. And they want PowerPoint, or they want to show videos and whatever. But if you think about all those technologies are technologies of entertainment, right? To be entertained rather than to listen, to learn, to force your brain to think. So every time we displace pedagogy onto entertainment, we are also displacing thought itself from an active mode to a passive mode, from having to think and forcing ourselves to think, to being okay with simply receiving information. So people always ask me, why don't I do PowerPoint? Well, that's the reason. Because if I do PowerPoint, people just look at the pictures, they take snapshots, and they don't think. And so for me, that's highly problematic. And also, I think it makes you a lazy presenter, right? If you can't present without showing pictures, then it's because you haven't done enough work to be a good presenter. So it kind of forces me to be a good presenter as well. This, I'll tell you a secret, right? I learned how to be a presenter working as a DJ in nightclubs. Because if you suck there, everybody has a bad time. Right. Any other questions, or should I start answering these questions, or do the people who are looking at their phones just want to leave and I bid you farewell?
Can I?
Yeah, of course, but I just let that people
Okay,
who are
just
bored
want
on
to
their
make a
phones.
kind
If
of
you want to leave,
connection,
feel free.
because a moment ago you mentioned about schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Equivalent to uncontrolled desire,
Uncontrolled production.
uncontrolled production. You know, I mean, I just want to take a look at the contents of your book, just the content, okay? I think the last chapter, the title is Control Assemblage. So I'm just curious about what the control means. Who's in control? If it's an assemblage, it seems to me kind of dynamic. Yeah, always in process, always moving. So I'm just curious about the title. Since you are here, so could you please tell us the gist of the last chapter?
Yeah, of course. So that phrase comes from an essay that Deleuze wrote towards the end of his life called Control Society. It was called Postscriptum and Control Society. And the term control in that context was taken from William Burroughs. So it's kind of a paranoid thing. So the other thing I was saying about the idea of the assemblage is that we don't have just our own assemblage. We're all caught up in other people's assemblages, and those assemblages can vary at scale, right? So, one of the ways you can look at it is if you look at Foucault's book on surveillance, for example, on surveillance, punish and so forth. Those are also assemblages, but surveillance is a massive assemblage.
Oh.
But what's interesting about surveillance is that we tend to think of it as something that is negative, but we are the most surveilled people in the world voluntarily. If you have a Google phone, which I have, a Google phone can be tracked even if you take the battery out and you take the chip out, it still can be tracked. Like Google knows where your phone is wherever. So all those spy shows where they go, oh my God, take the battery out, throw it away, now we're safe. Total bullshit. Google phone can be tracked everywhere. And so, the other story I always like to tell is that in the 1970s, Coca-Cola, one of the executives of Coca-Cola, gave a presentation where he told all his staff, our global plan is for Coca-Cola, for a can of Coca-Cola to be no more than 2 meters away from every single person on the planet. And at the time, people thought that was ridiculous, like how is that even possible? But if you think about cell phones, if people get more than 2 meters from their phone, they start to get anxious. They're like, I'm lonely for my phone. And, most people can't actually do anything other than have their phone. So in other words, 2 meters is the joke. Now it's in our pocket, it's in our hand. The particularly Taiwanese thing I see with people with their phones on a thing around their neck, like it's a noose around their neck. So they, phones constantly. There's been no device in the history of humanity that has been more rapidly taken up than the cell phone. But the cell phone tracks everything. Like if you imagine somebody looking over your shoulder that walked with you everywhere you went, that kept a record of every single thing that you ever purchased, that looked at every photo that you took, that read every email that you ever wrote or received, that looked at everything that you liked on Facebook and kept a record of it, you would be horrified. You'd be like, oh my God, what is happening? I'm being stalked. But that is everyone's experience with the phone. We are all surveyed to a depth that if you were doing a university research project and you said, I really want to really study what people are doing, you would never get ethics approval. People would be like, oh my God, you couldn't possibly have that invasion of people's privacy. And yet, we invite it in. And not only that, we pay money to have it. We spend money to get the phone, we spend money on our phone plan. Like we actively spend money in order to give all our information to companies who then sell it to other companies. And we're not even allowed to use these devices if we don't, first of all, agree to giving up all our data. Like imagine if you went to a shop and you go into a clothing shop and the clothing shop, as you walk in the door, says, hang on a minute, you can't come into my shop until you agree to let me know everything about your entire life, every place you've been, everything you've done, etc., etc. You can't come into my shop until you do that. We'd be like, hell no, I'm going to find a different shop. But there is not one single app on your phone where you have not had to make that agreement before you started using it. So we are the most surveyed people in history, like the Nazis, Stasi, Soviets, nothing, not even close to being the level of surveillance that we have volunteered for. So much so that Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, said, I don't think privacy is even a thing anymore. It's not something society even thinks about. So if you think about that as a form of desire, we kind of tell ourselves that we desire freedom, we desire our privacy, and so on, and yet we have willingly given all that up in order to have a cell phone. So what are the affordances of a cell phone that are so powerful to us that we willingly give up our privacy in order to have them and cannot contemplate life without them, to the point where people genuinely talk about it as having an addiction. So that's what I mean, like these are assemblages. Like if you look at your phone, it's full of a whole bunch of different kinds of content which we think are very interesting. Facebook is one kind of assemblage, Instagram would be another one, etc., etc. But that is within another set of assemblages which operate at a different scale, which is, well, in order to have those assemblages, I'm willing to give up my freedom, I'm willing to give up my privacy, I'm willing to give my data. Like if my data, if someone else is selling my data, then in a sense they're selling my mental labour, I should get paid for it, right? Like who makes Facebook interesting? It's not the people who work at Facebook. It's the 2 billion people who don't work at Facebook that do it for free every single day, but we don't get paid for it, right? So that's assemblages. It's trying to understand how those different systems, how they came into being, how they're legitimate, how they are operative, how they interact with one another, why they rise, why they fall, why kids are not using Facebook now in the way that they used to. My children who have grown up as well, they tell me that Facebook's for old people. Young kids now probably moved on from TikTok, but that was for a while the thing that young people did, and Snapchat and so forth. And you have America now saying they want to get rid of Chinese cars out of America because they're worried about the AI that's in it, and they're worried about the surveillance capabilities of cars and so on and so forth. Never mind the fact that all the phones are made in China, with chips from here, so there's a lot of posturing going on there. All right, so I did talk about the questions now, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. Strata is a topological metaphor which indicated the possibility of getting the concept of expression and geometry at the same time. Can we say this kind of metaphor is like trying to describe the assemblages, or can we say it is a kind of performative? So I think there's two things there. Is that topology or performative? In a way it is both, right? It has to be both. The assemblage is always performative because it is always doing something. Like if there's no such thing as an inert assemblage. In the same way that there cannot be an inert desire. Desire must always be doing something, so it must be performative. But it's performative in the precise sense that its existence is the same as doing. Okay, so when the classic description of performative of I now pronounce you husband and wife, or wife and wife, or whatever, the saying and the doing is the same thing. So the assemblage is performative in that sense. And yes, it can also be understood as a topology of desire, and which is simply a way of trying to draw it. Again, if you tried to draw your desire, what would you do with it? What would it look like? What is your desire doing? And so we, in a sense, represent our desire to ourselves in the form of lines. So, desire is going along here, but it also kind of goes around in circles, and we're constantly trying to find ways of representing desire to ourselves, for which topology would just be one. Second question, the philosopher Whitehead considered the philosophy as modes of thought, whether the modes of thought are related to the idea of the toolbox. And apparently I mentioned that the idea of the toolbox in relation to the assemblage, and whether assemblages could be thought of as a toolbox. So yes, I mean the short answer is yes, the concept is always a tool and would always be part of a toolbox that we would want to use. The other thing that I have always said is that you cannot use the concept of the assemblage by itself, because by itself it is in a way meaningless. It has at least a couple of other concepts that we would have to presuppose, which are the body without organs and the abstract machine. No assemblage without those two concepts as well. And so this is for you when you're reading the book. These three concepts always go together. So if you remember that, it's the Holy Trinity, just Catholics, the Holy Trinity, these three concepts must always go together. And that will help you to navigate. It will be like your North Star as you're going through the text. Keep looking for my Holy Trinity, it'll take you places. So what are they? Well, somewhere, I don't even remember where I wrote this. Someone was saying I've written a lot before, which I haven't written that much, but I have written enough such that I forget where I wrote things. Maybe that's just old age, I don't know. But I did write a thing about the Type A 101, which I visited some years ago. And for those of you that haven't visited it, in the middle of it, there is this giant sort of pendulum, right? Which was translated as the sort of wind stabilization system. So the idea is that if the building goes this way, the pendulum goes that way, and it essentially stabilizes the whole structure. So if you take that idea and then you think about desire, desire is always fundamentally unstable, because we always, in a sense, want more than we can have, and desire, so we're going all over the place. So something needs to stabilize our desire. Something needs to give it some sort of consistency, give it some sort of dimension, and that would be the body without organs. So the body without organs is then, if you like, the condition of possibility of our desire, or what I have more recently wanted to translate and to think about as affect. So affect, in sort of pop psychology terms, and I don't think it's wrong, it's just that's where you would find it. Affect is your capacity to get out of bed in the morning. You know, how do I feel about the day? Can I get up? Can I do things? Do I feel happy? Do I feel sad? You know, that is affect, right? But it's the capacity to feel in a certain way. Okay? So that's what the body without organs is. The body without organs is your capacity to feel in a certain way. But what's interesting about it is that you can do things to influence your capacity to feel, right? You think, you know, all those kind of things you see on Facebook and so forth about, you know, self-care days and so forth. Well, those are practices that you use in order to modify your body without organs, in order to modify your capacity to feel in a particular way on a given day. If I do this thing, then I know that tomorrow I'll feel better and I'll be able to face the day, but I can't face the day today, you know, in a way my body without organs needs to be repaired. So one way of thinking about that concept is your capacity to act. Not the action itself, it's the capacity to act. The things that you do in order to sustain that capacity to act would then be the assemblages. They sort of sit on top of the body without organs. And then the idea of the abstract machine then would be the historicization of that diagram. So you have my capacity to act, the things that I do to sustain that capacity to act that happen within a historical set of circumstances. You know, as Marx, I'll tell you the story. There's a famous quote by Marx who says, "Man makes history, but not in conditions of his own choosing." Right? And I was talking to my dean, who has since retired, and I'm very glad because she was an extremely dumb person. And I said this to her, you know, there's this famous quote, Marx said this, and she said, "Oh, did Marx say that? I didn't know that. It's really clever." I was like, why do I have a dean who's so goddamn stupid? Anyway, luckily they have retired and gone off to annoy other people, not me. But that's the abstract machine. That is the historicization of desire. The abstract machine is what must be presupposed for this set of desiring practices to occur. So the example I like to use, and this goes to what we were talking about earlier about urban design. I should have asked you 2 points on that. Urban design is, some of you probably not old enough to remember the film Flying Pine. You remember that film? It was called Airplane. There's this character, and every time he goes to take a drink, he spills on himself. He goes, it was about then that I developed a drinking problem. Whereas me, I had a drinking problem, I couldn't drink it. Now what was I talking about? Urban design. Oh my God. I hate to see the transcript of this talk, people being like, was he on drugs? Going all over the place here. Could have gone anywhere. Yeah, so urban design. So I had a research grant with a couple of colleagues who were interested in the question of how would you increase the number of people who ride bikes for commuting purposes. And so we began to think about the design of cities, which in Australia are fundamentally designed for cars. They're not designed for bikes, they're not designed for people, they're designed for cars. And so once you start to dig into that, so I'll tell you a very quick history lesson. At the end of the war, Australian troops come home and the government has no money, there are no tradespeople to build anything because they're all soldiers and they're all gone off to war, and there's no material to build anything with. And so the government's like, well, what are we going to do? So what the government did was it gave people very, very cheap plots of land. It gave them a set of blueprints and it said, build the house yourself. And so literally tens of thousands of houses in Australia post-World War II were built by their owners. Some of them were terrible, some of them were good. But what was more important about that is that these houses were built in suburbs that did not have proper sewage. In some cases they did not have water, they did not have public transport, and all of that came later. Now if you think about that, it's a terrible model of urban design because now you've got the suburbs are proliferating, but they're proliferating faster than the infrastructure that is needed can catch up with it. The opposite happened in Japan. In Japan, post-war, the country's demolished, okay? And the Japanese said, well, the people cannot afford to build the cities, they can't afford to have cars, they can't afford to build houses and so on and so forth, so the government will build it. And so the government built railroads, they didn't build cars, they didn't build private roads, they built railroads. So Tokyo has nearly almost 1.5 times the population of Australia. Nobody drives cars, everyone's on trains because the train infrastructure is phenomenal, as it is here as well. But it's a different model of urbanism, but also a different model of desire. The Australian model of desire was own your own house, own your own car, live out in your own space, and be like a sort of landlord out in your own space. In Japan it was, you have no space, you don't own your apartment, but you have trains, you can go places, you can do things. Very, very different model of desire. And the consequence, the cities look very, very different. So we were very interested in how do you analyse the desire that underpins a city. And we started to look at what are the assumptions about the people who live there that we can see embedded in the building design itself. And so the assumptions about Australians is that they don't want to live next to one another, they don't want to live in apartments, they want their own house, and so on and so forth. And even though at the time one could have said, well, they did that out of necessity, and that was 50, 60 years ago, it has embedded a model of Australian design that's very, very hard to shift now because the cities are enormous. Sydney has a population of 6 million, so by world standards it's a very small city, but it's enormous in scale. Like if you haven't been to Sydney then you have no idea for the size. But think Los Angeles, right? Think Los Angeles in size but with 1/4 of the population. So it's phenomenal, like it's this huge, huge space with almost no people in it by comparison. Oh, thank you. See, I've been talking too much. I need more water. Thanks so much. So that's the idea of the abstract machine. How do we analyse and think about the sort of what must be presupposed for this design to exist? And it's about asking the question from the perspective of desire, or saying that the material reality of the city is not a reflection of, but a sort of embodiment of desire, and that we can read that from that. Question 3. Apparently I considered Dada and Surrealism as absurd machines in my book. I like the fact that you think I would remember this. find that very flattering. And then, so the data machine is regarded as a design machine, thus both the observed machine, design machine, and art machines. The art machine produces chance as well as nonsense. The art machine may play the logical sense, even the event making. On the other hand, what that organ is more like an event. The event may be disrupted, disconnected, or delayed. My point is, could the art machine simply distinguish from? Because whose question was that? It's missing the last part. Your question. What? Tell me what was the last bit? Distinguish from?
Excuse me?
You say, my point is that could the art machine simply distinguish from?
Oh, from no organs.
Oh, from the body that organs. The art machine and the body that organs is different. Is that what you're saying? Ah. No, I think they are the same, right? The art machine for the artist is how they are making their body that organs. So one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari say is that the body that organs is a practice. That it's not a concept and it's not a thing, it's a practice. It's what we do in order to sustain desire and to sustain our capacity to act and to interact in the world. So in that sense, the art machine and the body that organs are identical. But that would also mean that they are different for each person. So when I look at, Duchamp or whatever, I don't see the same thing that he would have seen when he was producing his art. But perhaps I also get something from it that is kind of what he was trying to do. But it doesn't really matter whether I do or I don't. It still can be productive for me, even if it's productive in a different way. The example from Man Ray and the Dance of Danger, it's a very interesting one. I did talk about it in my book, I remember now. But I don't think I said all the things that can be said about it, because I thought of some other things later. So those of you who don't know it, you can Google the image Dance of Danger. I have seen a version of it at the Pompidou Centre in Paris. So it's basically very similar to the bicycle. It's got a bicycle gear connected to something else. And Guattari says what's important is that the machine doesn't work. That's what makes it art, that it doesn't work. And I've always wondered what he meant about that. But in part, what he means is that if you jump on a bicycle and you ride it down the street, you don't think of it in terms of art, you think of it in terms of mobility and something else. But when you disassemble it and you put the pieces together into an image, they no longer work as a bicycle works, but now it can work in a new way. So the disruption of machines also is one of the ways in which it can produce art. And I think that one of the things that people don't say enough, in my view, is that Guattari was a massive reader of Russian formalism. Like, he quotes a lot of Russian formalism, and so this is straight out defamiliarization. Like, how do you produce a work of art? You defamiliarize, you deconstruct the object, bring out the sort of historical dimensions of it as a way of making art. So I think that that would be how I would answer that question. Question 4. In general situations, the design of a profession with a clear purpose and normativity while pursuing creative solutions. A profession which spans purpose, normativity, and does not want to neglect creativity, how should it be viewed and classified within the philosophical system? Whose question is this one? Yours. I feel like I'm missing something here. So it's the profession that you want to talk about, the profession of design, is that correct?
Yeah.
And how should we talk about that?
Because the most designers, when they started design, actually they have their own design.
Yeah.
Yeah, and their own purpose put in their brain. And then they make it to the practice vertical objects for the landscape, all the materials, even like the fence are the elements they can apply. However, my question is, even those kind of materials like plants and vegetables, trees, flowers, what else is from the nature, right? From the nature. However, organized by humans' idea. So humans' idea actually have something like rational ideas, functional ideas, but the elements they apply with, uncontrolled, because you cannot figure out what about the trees will grow 10 years or 20 years. And then how we measure about this kind of chaos. Because after 10 years or 20 years, the result may not maintain in your original ideas.
Yeah.
So how to come to the later judgment about this kind of chaos in landscape design?
Yeah, well, when I do my own gardening, I always tell people that my goal with gardening is to make it look neglected, not merely abandoned. Which, is a joke. But also, it's an interesting starting point, right? Because abandoned is pure chaos. Neglected is somewhere not exactly chaos, but something less than that. Towards completely controlled, which is the model of the French garden, which feels, or even the Japanese garden, which feels almost antiseptic. Like, desire can't live here, it's not for you. It's for God or something, but it's not for you. So I think that that's sort of how we think about gardens, right? Like we actually want the tension between the wild abandon, the neglect, and the controlled and the sculpted. And that there is the dynamic that we really want to see. And like, when flowers arrive, and bees and birds and so forth, then you get a different kind of chaos because it brings the sounds of those creatures and so on. The other day I was walking my dog and this woman was walking her dog on the opposite sides of the road, and she stops and she says, "Do you hear that?" I'm like, and she says, "It's the bees." And I said, "Yeah, you're right. I can hear these bees, a big swarm of bees up in the tree." She just goes, "So beautiful." And then just walked off. Like, I've never met this woman before. I don't know her at all. Evidently she lives in my neighborhood, I guess. But it was a really nice moment. Like, she was, we both stopped there and we heard this thing, which was, an intrusion into our space, but a disruption of our sort of oral space, but also something that we both recognised as beauty. And I think that's an old debate, right? The debate between beauty and sublime. These are old debates, which I don't think those would even begin to say we've settled. But what's interesting is that those ways of thinking about it change over time. And that's the interesting question. Why did one garden used to be regarded as beautiful this way, but it's another? So like in Western Australia, when I was a kid growing up, quite rightly, because Western Australia is very desert-like, there was a lot of desert plants that were really popular, cactuses and that sort of thing, which was also popular in Los Angeles and San Diego. But they're not so popular anymore. They're sort of regarded as being kind of old-fashioned. A lot of them are imported cactuses, and now people grow endemic plants that are more, obviously local plants. And so an entire new fashion has shaped it, but it's a new principle. The principle used to be desert plants for a desert environment. It didn't matter if those plants came from Mexico or whatever. Now it's endemic plants for our environment. There's a kind of nativism involved in it. So there's always an idea underpinning that, which would be the abstract machine. In my opinion, that's the abstract machine. So that would be how I want to think about it. What is the source of the ideas and how do they play out, and what's the tension within that? And that would be, the tension would be the abstract machine. That's why the assemblages, that tension. So they say all assemblages have a kind of cutting edge. That which can be included versus that which can't be included. It's okay in this garden to have cactus, but not in this garden. And how do you make that decision? So that's sort of how I would approach it. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but conscious that I have rambled on and haven't answered everyone's questions, I'll push on. Man Ray's ready-mades seem to have a mechanism of social interaction and dialogue, such as his To Be Destroyed. However, when Man Ray attempts to use women as a subject in his works that enters the discussion of assemblage, it seems that he still remains within the framework of the Oedipus complex. Does Man Ray feel a sense of helplessness regarding this phenomenon? Whose question is that?
My wife.
Your wife? Oh,
sorry,
but she's not
absent. She's absent. Because she's got to work.
So we can't ask her what she was thinking there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I can skip that question if she's not here. But I like the question. I think it's very interesting. I don't know that I have an answer to it, but I do want to tell her to write me and tell me that her answer to the question, because clearly she does have one. Yeah, I can't imagine that she wrote that question without already knowing what the answer was. So tell her to if she would be so kind as to send me her answer, the idea of helplessness. I think that's
No problem.
interesting. Question 6. Can Man Ray's works be seen as using, is this her question as well?
Yeah.
Women in the 5 senses into the structure of social violence. This is her as well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Following this, can it be understood that Man Ray and Deleuze are using the same path to analyse culture? That I would say no, because they are historically separated in time by almost a generation. And he's American, they're French, so I don't think necessarily the same path. Clearly influenced, and they obviously were interested in his work. So there would be, again, a family resemblance, but without being identical. I don't think identical would be the right way to think about it, but certainly one could say that they are like contours, side by side, travelling in the same direction. Question 7. Currently, AI turns into a very popular trend. AI probably will be included in nearly most of the assemblages from education to art. How do you think about AI would be interactive in special material and expressive forms? Will it engage in make a new society of control, and how will desire produce differently with AI engaged? Who is that question?
It's already answered.
I was going to say, did I already answer it enough? Okay. That's good. I don't want to talk about AI.
Well, I'm more interested about what is its influence about art and education, just like you mentioned, creativity being killed and skill being killed. Yeah, that's
Yeah, I was reading this on the plane yesterday. I was reading a biography of Shakespeare by Roger Ackroyd. Was it something Ackroyd? Roger Ackroyd is the Christian one. Anyway, Ackroyd. And what is interesting about this? Oh my God! I advise no one to read Shakespeare biographies because they actually know nothing about Shakespeare, right? So, like the whole book, 500 pages in the conditional. Shakespeare might have walked down the street. Shakespeare might have read this book. Shakespeare might have done this. He might have done that. But my God, what did he actually do? We know that. But one of the things that was interesting in what I was reading is that apparently one of the exercises that the students had to do when he was a student was they were given fragments of poems that had been cut up, and then they were asked to reassemble the poems, and each student reassembled a poem for himself, and therefore produced a poem. And it was sort of making the point about the idea of emulation, that emulation can be a pathway to creativity. But what's interesting is that AI is doing exactly that, but it's the machine that's doing it, not us that's doing it. So I guess my thought is we need to think about who is writing the algorithms for creativity, for AI creativity, and asking the question, well, what are they putting into the algorithm? What are their ways of thinking about creativity? So I think rather than asking what can they do, I would want to ask the prior question of how do they do it, and what has been thought about that. So there's been quite a lot of work on this. Like I spend a lot of time working on technology, and I find it immensely fascinating because it really is shaping the future. But for example, Amazon tried to create an AI system to recruit staff. Okay? And they would receive 20,000, 30,000 applications a year for these jobs. And after using it for about a decade, they finally realised that they couldn't solve one particular problem, which was that the AI system overwhelmingly picked men. Because men would write their CVs in a particular kind of way. They would be like, I'm amazing, I'm a real leader, I do this and I do that, just ask me, whatever. And the women would always be much more modest and would not say, I'm amazing, oh, I do some good things, and I've been known to do this, and whatever. So when my daughter was applying for a job recently, someone said to her, her friend said to her, listen, if you want a job, you have to pretend you are a straight white man. That's how you write, that's how you get the job. But if you imagine that the whole algorithm is written to recognise what straight white men say about themselves to other straight white men, then the machine can't do anything other than continue to pick straight white men. And this is what Amazon found. Amazon's one of the biggest tech companies in the world, and they found that they could not solve it. The level of language, they could not solve it. They couldn't write an algorithm that enabled them in a machine way to choose the difference between men and women and to find multiple forms of intelligence. So the point I'm making then is the tech guys keep telling us that they can solve all the problems, but they haven't even asked the right questions. And so we as the non-tech people have to keep reminding them that they haven't asked the right questions because they don't even know what the right questions are to ask. And keep showing them that they're not asking the right questions. And AI is inevitable. It will happen. It's already happening. We're not going to stop it. But we can make sure that it's better than what it currently is, and we can make sure that it reflects a more global, generous, inclusive form of desire as opposed to straight white men and everything. So that would be my ranking answer to that. Question A. Deleuze emphasizes that assemblages are fluid, open, and non-totalizing structures, but does this lead to an inability to effectively critique the power relations and forms of impression in society? It's a very long question, I won't really read all of it. Does this theory provide us with the practical tools to deconstruct the digital surveillance system? So I think I talked about that as well.
Control something.
Yeah, the control society. But what I will also say is, I don't know if you've read, do you anyone read Wendy Brown's books? So Wendy Brown is, I guess, kind of more famous as being Judith Butler's wife than being a scholar in her own right. Although she is a very famous scholar as well. But I read a lot of Judith Butler's books, and then I thought, I've never actually read Wendy Brown's books. This is quite shameful. I haven't read her books. So I made a point this year recently of trying to start working my way through them. And one of the things that she says, well, there's a couple of things that she says which I found really, really interesting. And one of the things that's relevant to this conversation is that she says one of the problems with Foucault is that he talks about power, but he does not talk about domination. And that what Marxism was always trying to bring into the conversation was domination. In what ways are we dominated? And it seems to me that Deleuze is probably along the same lines, that he has not wanted to talk about domination, has been kind of okay with talking about power, but he's always talking about regimes of escape, how to get away from. And nobody's really talking about domination, perhaps seems too old-fashioned. So I think that one of the things that if you were going to critique Deleuze and Guattari, or wanting to reimagine their work, I would probably say let's think how we bring that question of domination back into it. And to think about surveillance as not simply something that happens to us, but is also a form of dominance that we do not even recognize. And that's surely the ultimate form of dominance that there is. There's a famous kind of parable, if you like. It's repeated in one of Norman Mailer's novels. But he says, the devil, so Satan, the devil's greatest trick was to make us believe that he did not exist. And so, in other words, that's what we have now. We have a situation in which we have kind of been encouraged to believe domination does not exist. Or if it does exist, it only exists in other places that are not here. Like China has domination, but we don't have domination. Or Afghanistan has domination, but we don't have domination. And so domination is always something that happens elsewhere that does not happen to us. And so perhaps it's time that we kind of bring that question home to ourselves. So yes, I think it's definitely a problem. I don't think it's a problem that's not addressable within their work, but it's definitely something that's not foregrounded enough. Question 9, how to use nomadism in Deleuze's thought to view a contemporary urban life where settlement has become the mainstream and homeless living on the edge of streets. Whose question is this one? Very, very nice question, so thank you. Super quickly, my response would be, if we go back to the idea of the abstract machine, I was giving a class about this actually a couple of weeks ago with my own students, so I think it's an enormously important issue. But I always ask them to think about this. What kind of a society can tolerate the existence of homelessness? In other words, the question is not about homelessness or homeless people. The question is about wealthy people tolerating the fact that they exist when they have the wealth and the means for them to not exist. So Australia is quite fortunate. We have a quite low level of homelessness, but we still do have it. I don't know what the situation is in Taiwan. But for those of you that have been to India, for example, the level of homelessness in India is monumental. Like, it's just horrific. And people say, oh, but India is a poor country. But India is not a poor country. Like India, if you go back to the 1500s, India was vastly wealthier than Europe, right? I'm sure the Brits came along and they stole a whole bunch of their money, but sure. But it's still a wealthy country. There's more millionaires in India than there are in the US. And just as many billionaires. Like, it's a rich, rich country. But it's a rich country that has enabled the concentration of wealth in a very small number of hands, so that some people live in absolutely abject poverty and others live in outrageous wealth. Like Ambani has a 27-story house. Who the fuck needs that? I'm all for the revolution where that's concerned. So how do we use nomadism? I guess I would say I wouldn't want to see nomadism be used to talk about the homelessness as though somehow they're doing better than we think. Nomadism I see as the idea of the war machine is the idea of a form of thought that attacks the state form itself. So I would say nomadism would be the form of thought that compels the state to recognise that homeless people should be intolerable to the state itself. That the state cannot consider itself to be a just state while there are homeless people around. So that for me was that's how I would want to use nomadism, as that which would attack the state form itself. Does that make sense to you? Question 10, if an artist must create to be happy, is that really creativity? Who asked that question? You did. What do you mean by that?
I'm curious about, I want to touch the creativity, but I have the situation.
My hearing is not good enough to hear you, I'm sorry. I'm going to come down here so I can hear you. Yeah. This is like a TV talk show.
The question is my experience.
Your question is your experience. So if you create art and that makes you happy, then you're worried that that's not really creative.
Yeah.
So you have to be miserable to be an artist. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, you be miserable then, so you can make good art. Well, I don't think I can answer that question in any intelligent way. I suppose I would suggest that if it makes you happy, then that can't be a bad thing. But if it makes you sad, that could also be a good thing for your art. And a lot of people say that about writers, They only write good books when they have a bad relationship. But no, I don't think that I would want to make any kind of correlation between how you feel and the kind of authenticity of the art. I think it's not for you to judge in any case, right? Like, it's always for somebody else to judge in terms of what they think about it. But if you're producing for yourself and it works for you, then to me that's art, and that's what art should do, and who cares? I mean, bear in mind, Van Gogh, or Van Gogh, never sold a single artwork in his lifetime. Not one, right? Not a single one. And most recent works of his have sold for upwards of $500 million US. Okay, so he never saw that in his lifetime. In fact, his mother burned all the art that he left at home because she was embarrassed by it. She didn't want people to see how crap his art was. So nobody's a judge except you, and you just do what you need to do. That's what Van Gogh did. And he transformed art. He didn't get to live to see it, but he did it anyway. So yeah, I don't think one needs to bring those two things together. Last question. can the machines that Deleuze discusses be thought of in terms of composability? So in class we discussed various examples such as the mutual influence between animals and plants due to the interactions, and Kafka's Metamorphosis tells the absurd narrative of a person becoming a worm. I think you mean cockroach? But anyway, which triggers different views on life. These examples seem to emphasise connections that transcend boundaries. It's like how a machine can take on different forms of being assembled with various components. A machine can become many things but will not be confined to just one, existing in a state of indeterminacy and fluidity. So I think I kind of answered that already, that sort of is how all machines are. That they have something which pulls them together, and at the same time within that system there is something that is constantly pulling them apart. And so therefore all machines are kind of a tension between two forces, the forces of composition, of coming together, and forces of decomposition, of falling apart. And those forces would be both internal and external, right? Like you desire something today that maybe you won't desire it tomorrow, but also you could desire something today and still desire it tomorrow, but be under so much pressure externally that that desire cannot sustain itself in the face of external pressure. So desire is always coming together and always falling apart, and we engage in practices to try to sustain our desire or to transform it into another form that would be more sustainable. Alright, I have spoken for 2 hours solid. I've answered all your questions. I'm tired of the sound of my own voice, so thank you very much, and I'm going to stop.